to let it ride, and hopefully she jumps in. Dr. Burge and Carol can handle this. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, 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 welcome. So we are here in the webinar. We are also live on Facebook. If you could share it, ask your friends to join. If you know any activists, any organizers, this is a great call to be on. Please share, tag, share, all of that good stuff. So it's 3:03. We'll get started. Today we are talking about election polling and you know, how that communicates to Black voters and the messaging that is used to attract Black voters or to encourage them to get out and vote. We're also going to talk a little bit about organizing and how that has connected in Georgia, and what messaging and what I guess tactics, not tactics, but what practices they used to get out the vote in that area. So we have with us today Dr. Camille Burge. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Villanova University, where she also serves as assistant director for the Center for Peace and Justice Education. Her research and teaching areas of expertise lie within political psychology and racial and ethnic politics. Her research has been published in top-tier political science journals. Camille has given many public lectures on race and ethnicity and American politics. We welcome you. We're going to talk a little bit later about your new project, Sis, Are You Okay? We'll also have joining us, she's running a little bit behind, Tamika Atkins with Pro Georgia. She's executive director of Pro Georgia, which is a Georgia state-based nonpartisan voter engagement advocacy organization and a member of State Voices National Network of Tables. Prior to working with Pro Georgia, Tamika is founding director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance Atlanta chapter, where she developed a base of African American domestic workers advocating for respect, recognition, and inclusion in labor protections for all domestic workers. Over the course of 4 years, Tamika has organized domestic workers to fight for the expansion of Medicaid and used a gender and race lens to increase Black women's civic engagement and their participation in the chapter. Before that, Tamika worked with Amnesty International USA. And then third, we have joining us today, which is one of the leaders here in the state of Texas, Carol G. Robinson, Esquire. Carol is chair of the Texas Coalition of Black Democrats. He is a thought leader, political analyst, and commentator. He served as an at-large council member for the city of Houston and as a Houston Community College trustee. He has also represented the city of Houston on various boards. He is an associate professor and former associate dean of internal affairs at the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We are going to kick off. Oh, there's Tamika Atkins. Okay, so I was reading, so I wasn't able to see you. So hello, welcome, thank you. So we're going to kick this off and give everybody kind of a round robin, and give you 10 minutes to just talk about who you are and what your connection is to this election, polling, and advocacy. So thank you very much. We have also with us Kendall Locke, and he is our tech professional in the background. So hi, Kendall, thank you. And also, okay, Dr. Burge, please go. Oh, I'm Tracy Scott. Did I say that part? No. Tracy Scott with the Black Women's PAC. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our third annual Policy, Politics, and Donor Summit. This is our second conversation. Last night we did redistricting. Today, again, is election polling and advocacy and messaging. And then we'll also have a third conversation next Friday with LaTosha Brown of Black Voters Matter. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I look forward to this dialogue. So Dr. Burge, please take it away.
All right, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, and thank you, Tracy, for the invitation. Panelists, everyone on this call, whether you're actually here on the Zoom or joining us from live, I know we're all pretty zoomed out at this point of the year, so I appreciate your presence this afternoon. So I'm going to speak today from the topic of feeling the 2020 election, examining the relationships between race, emotions, and polling, largely because Tracy asked me to, but also because this is within my wheelhouse of the things that I study within political science. So there's so much happening in American politics right now. We're in the middle of a global health pandemic where infection rates are soaring, hospital beds are dwindling, people have lost their jobs and homes after complying with police instructions. George Floyd was brutally murdered by police, spawning global protests against police brutality. Breonna Taylor was unarmed and murdered in her apartment by police. With all of this that's happening, we just finished an incredibly important election season, where we witnessed unprecedented levels of turnout among racial and ethnic minorities, resulting in the first woman of color vice president and my soror, Kamala Harris. And so throughout all of these different events, there have been a number of emotional reactions. People are angry, they're anxious, they're afraid, they're sad, they're disgusted, they're grief-stricken. And then somewhere in all of that, there's the silver lining of hope. There's pride, there's enthusiasm. And so the first question is, what effect might these emotional experiences have on our politics? The second is, what connections do these experiences then have to the polling industry? That is, to what extent do they result in effective or ineffective polling? And these are the questions I hope to answer in my brief time. So if I wasn't a good educator, I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a little outline. I'll begin really briefly by defining emotions and understanding their role in politics. We're going to focus on the group-centric experiences of anger and enthusiasm. Then I'll make my connections with emotions to the polling industry, especially as it pertains to what we see with polling Black Americans during the election season and or outside of the election season. So when we're talking about emotions, the American Psychological Association defines an emotion as a complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavioral, and psychological elements. These experiences have a few different components: a subjective experience or some kind of stimulus, a physiological response, and a behavioral or an expressive response. And so what does this mean for politics? Well, there's some political scientists that wrote a book called Affective Intelligence and Political Judgment. They wrote it in 2000, Georgie Marcus, Russell Newman, and Michael McEwen. And so as if we needed any more confusion between affect and effect, affect refers to emotions in the psychology literature, thus affective intelligence. So in this book, the central claim of their theory is that when citizens encounter a novel or threatening actor, event, or issue on the political horizon, a process of fresh evaluation and political judgment is triggered. And so in this work, they turned around the causal ordering of emotions in politics. Instead of think first, feel second, they reversed it and argued that feeling precedes thinking. And because feeling various emotions precedes thinking, they argued that it shapes our public opinion and our political decision-making. In the numerous publications that followed, many scholars were interested in understanding how experiencing various emotions at the individual level might lead us to changes in public opinion and political behavior. So these are screenshots of some of my published works. Throughout my published articles, my working book manuscript titled Fired Up, Ready to Go, Pride, Shame, and Anger in Black Politics, I argue that focusing on the individual level experience of emotions and even using some of these more candidate-centric emotions questions that we ask, that it provides us with a limited understanding of the full experience of emotions in politics, because we know that politics are group-centric. right? It's not just how Camille feels or Tracy or Tamika. It's about how we might feel as members of groups that we identify with, that we think are important. And so what I argue in my work is that emotions become political and hence potent when groups experience them. And we know that emotions have been at the core of every group-related struggle for inclusion in American democracy. The acute and vocalized emotions of those feeling the most disenfranchised, marginalized, or oppressed are what brings about major policy shifts and, of course, political movement. But only recently have political psych scholars begun to explore the possibility of group-centric emotions in politics. These works focus on affective polarization among partisans, this idea that when you experience anger as a partisan, that it might shape how much you trust government or not. And more recently, this growing body of literature on collective experiences of Black anger, right? And what that means for our public opinion and political decision-making. So what is anger? Anger is defined as a belief that we or our friends have been unfairly slighted, which causes in us both painful feelings and a desire or impulse for revenge. It's a negative emotion, wherein blame for undesirable behavior and resulting undesirable events is directed at another person or group. Professor Antoine Banks at the University of Maryland states that anger is experienced when a person has been threatened, and more importantly, when an individual is certain about who's responsible or blameworthy for the offense. In his seminal book, Emotion and Adaptation, Professor of Psychology Richard Lazarus states that if we blame someone for the wrongdoing, it requires that we believe that the individual could have acted differently, that they had control over the offending action. And so the individual, or maybe the group of people that we're blaming, is the appraisal that grows out of the context of threat and frustration. So when we're angry, the psychology research suggests that it produces a desire to regain control, remove the obstruction, and if necessary, attack the source of injury, right? And wouldn't you know that we're seeing all of these things right now when we're thinking about what's going on in politics. We view anger as a mobilizing emotion. It leads people to engage in more costly forms of political participation: voting, attending a rally, working for a campaign, donating money to candidates and causes, and of course, protests. We don't have to look too far from the mainstream to understand how, especially Black Americans, experiencing emotions as members of their racial group gets translated into the political space. I fielded a study in the fall of 2017 about these emotional reactions, especially in the age of Trump, President Trump. And so this was in 17, right? And this quote is talking about police brutality. I always expected this country to want to make progress toward living up to its ideals of giving effective equality, liberty, and justice to everyone. The rise of Donald Trump and his ilk has led me to question my beliefs in the essential goodness of the American people. The blatant excusing of police brutality against Black people also makes me angry and sad on a regular basis. I've come to the conclusion that I might be better off living outside of the United States, a place where I was born and raised. I've come to feel the equal treatment that my ancestors fought over for generations might never be realized, and I'm quite disillusioned, right? So thinking about anger and attaching it to the racial group, and then what does this again mean in our politics? So in addition to anger and thinking about Black people, especially in the contemporary age, we know that women are also really angry. Thinking about intersectionality, Black women. And I think there's a really important thing to note here about intersectionality, and think about the ways in which Black women have been organizing, the ways they've been mobilizing, making decisions to run for local, state, and national offices at unprecedented rates. Not that Black men aren't doing these things as well, let's be clear. We're just seeing higher levels of engagement in these different areas among Black women. So beyond anger, in addition to anger, we know about enthusiasm and excitement. There's quite a bit of research about enthusiasm in politics. And so what we know from that body of work is that it leads people to engage in more cheap forms of participation, like talking to others about candidates, voting or displaying, wearing campaign paraphernalia. We also know quite a bit about pride when it comes to Black Americans, what this means for their political decision-making. So things like voting. Evelyn Simeon wrote an excellent book called Historic Firsts, where she talks about when individuals are the first of their group to run, it's like Barack Obama, or thinking about Kamala Harris, that this leads to greater political engagement, right? More likely to talk to these people, to talk to your friends, your neighbors about candidates, about voting, making sure they have a voting plan, more likely to display, wear campaign paraphernalia, more likely to want to help people to register to vote. So we know that pride also, has this really important effect, especially in Black politics. So how's all this connect to back to polling? And I'm looking at my time on my things. I've seen that I've already used up my 10 minutes, but this is the last two slides that I really want to talk about. How do these emotional experiences connect back to polling? And my short answer is that the polling industry really seems to only be invested in Black public opinion when something has occurred to ratchet up these emotional experiences. Right? So when we do have these historic firsts, like your Barack Obama, your Kamala Harris, your Stacey Abrams running for office, we see these oversamples of Black voters across the polling data. When something like the Rodney King beating, the O.J. Simpson trial, George Floyd more recently, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter, when race-related things are dominating the news cycle, that's when pollsters seem to pay attention to our opinions. But there's not a continued long-term investment in our opinions in the polling industry. If you get a chance, there are two really important pieces that highlight this background. One is from Gallup, one is from Roper. Gallup's history of polling on Black America, and in Roper's report, researching Black American public opinion. And so part of this issue is that we know a lot about white public opinion and political decision-making. And more often than not, Black people have been targets of white opinion in these polling questions, as opposed to agents with opinions. And what these two reports do is give us some reasons, as to why. Some of the samples are based on registered voters, which we know the overwhelming majority of Black Americans did not have the franchise, did not have the right to vote. Other reasons from other sources, right? Thinking about George Gallup and newspapers in the South refusing to publish his polls if he included data on Black Americans. And so the onus then fell to academics to do polling on Black Americans, Du Bois being one of the first, right? But it wasn't until the 1970s, the first really clear polling project done by psychologist Kenneth Clark and Black political and business leader Percy Sutton, when they started the Data Black Public Opinion polls with the intention of conducting polls on Black Americans. That's the first time that the polling industry in 1979, 114 years after 1865, focuses solely on Black public opinion. And that didn't last long, but you can read these reports on your own for more information. And so we need to do a better job, right? We shouldn't just be interested in Black public opinion during these points of inflection, but we should be interested in a continued effort to understand, Black public opinion and political behavior. And so some of the issues that we have with polling are the small sample sizes, other methodological issues. So it costs a lot of money to survey Black Americans. Where are they? How can we reach them? Anyone that does survey research with Black samples knows that it's costly to collect this data. There's also wide variation in polls and not a great deal of standardization. So the length of the survey, the amount of questions, the amount of time it takes to complete, the mode of the survey, face-to-face interviews, landlines, cell phones, robocalling, online polls, who has access to these things, who doesn't, variation in the time it's in the field. So because of this variation, it's hard to discern anything meaningful from the already small samples of Black Americans in the polls. The costs are high, the variation is wide. The kinds of questions being asked tend not to represent, the full Black experience. They lack an intersectional lens. We know a great deal about how cisgender Black people feel about politics, but little to nothing about the LGBT plus community. We're thinking about the topics that are being asked. Largely in the polling industry, we're focusing on discrimination and racial issues, but very little else. How do Black people feel about climate change? How do they feel about healthcare, wage gaps, food insecurity? We don't know much. So this is the end. The question that I asked to NCOBS, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, when I gave a presentation about polling in Black America, the way that I concluded that talk was, do we really want to know Black public opinion? Does the polling industry in America at large, do they really want to know how we feel and how raggedy many of us believe this ramshackle democracy is? If they really wanted to know, they'd make a way. They would stop oversampling when our issues seem to dominate the news coverage, when we seem to be expected to have some kind of emotional reaction to something taking place, and have a more consistent investment in our opinions, in our behaviors. And I'm not a doom and gloom person, so here's my hope. Here's my silver lining at the end of this dark tunnel, or my bright light, and it's not an oncoming train. Significant strides have been made by academics to pull together large and diverse surveys containing Black public opinion. But again, falling back onto academics. Gallup recently started the Center on Black Voices. Pew is beginning to invest more resources in studies of Black Americans. The Roper Center for Public Opinion Research has Say Their Names, Hear Their Voices. There's an African American Research Collaborative. The political scientists and some sociologists collaborate every 4 years to produce the collaborative multiracial post-election survey that's been really diverse and beneficial to understanding these opinions. And of course, the Black Futures Lab and the Black Census Project, containing over 30,000 Black respondents trying to unpack very diverse experiences, but not nearly as much of an investment as we should see from the larger polling industry. So thank you. If you'd like anything else, any more information about my research or teaching or service, you can visit my website.
So thank you very much, Dr. Burge. Okay, so I have questions, and I think a few others do, but we're going to hold your questions because I know Carole Robinson has a short window. So we're going to let you go, Carole Robinson, and talk more about polling and messaging and what you see coming forth.
So Tracy, thank you very much, and thank you for the conversations the Black Women's PAC is curating. I think I want to come at this having been a candidate for public office and also being in academia. You know, sometimes the two shall never meet, and a lot of stuff that's happening in academia does not always end up in the hands of people who are running for office or people who are in office governing. So let's take the polling, and then we'll go down the other items, the messaging and the organizing. There's now real questions around the abilities of pollsters to really scientifically indicate what is happening with people, and not just people of color, with the polling. And it's not just the 2016 or 2020 election. You go back to when polling started. I was looking at an article the other day where there was controversy over the scientific validity of public polling at the very outset of the notion of public polling. But all that said, we are here now, and we've gone through 2 presidential election cycles. And presidential election cycles simply means the presidential election is on the ballot, but you have a bunch of down ballot races also. And the nagging questions for people who are in the business of running for office and electing candidates is, what's wrong with the science that's being used? Is it the science, the modeling, or are people not really, 1, talking to us? 2, if they do talk to you, even if they think they're telling you the truth, it may not be, as the first speaker just said, the true emotional truth. And maybe all people in all groups are not alike, i.e. all Black people are not alike. And the diversity in the Black community is really not being scientifically comprehended and incorporated into the little bit of polling that does occur as it relates to African American. You know, the high water mark, the bright line, if you want to, is what happened when Doug Wilder was running for president. I mean, for governor of Virginia, and they started calling it the Wilder effect. Or you go back to when Bradley was running for governor of California, there were just people who would not tell you how they were really going to vote. And maybe we saw some of that phenomenon again in 2016 and 2020 around the presidential election. So right now, there's all kind of analysis going on about what went wrong with the polling. It missed two things. One, it missed the strength and level of the turnout. And then two, it missed what ended up to be the level of turnout for Trump voters. I think an even bigger question, because it's just not polling, is we really don't do post analysis of the people who actually showed up and voted. We have some exit polling data, and we're doing extrapolations of exit polling data. I just put out a piece. I think you sent it out, Tracy. It'll go out a little further. I generally try to write short because I've been in public office, and you know it's rare that you just have the time to read a lot. So the piece I put out is the question that we really need to answer. And what I'm going to be interested in talking to pollsters and political consultants and the like, or in the coming weeks, is the question really about the polling and the science, the technical, or is there some real shift that's going on out in the country and the electorate? And 16 and 20 were harbingers of this transformation that's underway. The presumption had always been that the more diverse and younger the electorate got, the more democratic it would be. And the reality, I call it groupthink. Sometimes the people who are doing these things fall into a state of mind that they don't want to hear what they consider the outlier opinion. But when in fact the outlier opinion or opinions are really more reflective of the reality of what people are thinking. You know, if you're good, when you do a focus group, you aren't really listening for the answers to the questions. You're really listening for the off-cuff commentary, what we would normally call the Freudian slip, which is really reflective of what you are really thinking. And that's what you're trying to figure out. What are people really thinking when you are trying to do the science of it? So the real big question to me is 2016 and 2020, were they Trump personality driven? If you are to believe with any kind of semi-credence, the exit polling data from the 2020 cycle, where it's being argued that Trump did better with Black men, slightly better with Black women, significantly better with white women, and there are real issues about where young people are going relative to the two political partisan parties. So there's a real conversation to be had, not only about the science, but also what is it that the science is trying to extrapolate to provide as information to political candidates, office holders, and decision makers. Now, let's shift over. In part, polling is because you're trying to get to 50+1 or be the top vote getter, depending on the electoral system you're running in. And so candidates are out there trying to get a real sense of what the voters are thinking so they can figure out how to put together this combination. One of the things I think that people have to take into real consideration now is that the idea that the Black community and the Hispanic community and even the Asian Pacific Islander community are monolith. I think some of that, if it hadn't been eliminated before, I think people now have to seriously stop talking about and categorizing. I'm gonna just do the Black community since I'm state chairman of an organization focused on winning Black voters. I don't think you can think of Black voters as monolith. I don't think people understand all the issues that the Black community cares about. We have a significant Black immigrant population in a lot of states and cities across America, but the immigration issue is dealt with, messaged, analyzed through the prism of it's a Hispanic Latino issue. And so a large swath of people who either intentionally view themselves as Black or are characterized by the social construct in America as Black are left out of that conversation. If you take the defund the police issue, which is now turned into a flashpoint on the Democratic side of the aisle, the reality is that there are a lot of Black people who want reform in the police department, but don't want police departments eliminated because the Black community suffers the most at the hand of crime and violence. So, you know, it's almost Du Bois kind of state of mind. Black folks in a lot of instances are holding two competing ideas at the same time. And if you are not cognizant of the nuances, you really don't know how to message to them. You know, I'm fortunate in this sense. I'm at one end of the age spectrum. I've got younger siblings underneath me, and then I have a son in his 20s. And if you talk to those three cohorts, you get significantly different perspectives on politics, policy, and how you should communicate with me and who is the best person to communicate with me. So for the folks who are interested in policy decision making, it's at two levels. That's the first level, but then there's also this secondary level. It's the substance of what you communicate, because climate change is not policy. Climate change is a terminology. The policy is separate and distinct. When you get into the detail, if you are not prepared to communicate the details in a way that people understand and see as beneficial, even if they agree with the goal, they may disagree with the path to the goal. And in a lot of instances, path to the goal is not being properly analyzed and not sufficiently analyzed. And so that's going to be another one of the conversation that has to, I hope, come out of all this post-election analysis that's going on, not only in Texas, not only inside the political parties, but also in the academy. Dr. Adams, who was originally going to be on the program, who's the former chairman of the political science department at the university I work at, and my comments today are my own. They're not being made on behalf of the university. But we have been engaged in polling young people since last year to try to get a real good sense of where they were on the 2020 campaign, but also to start to talk to them about issues like the census and what the repercussions and meanings of the decisions that would be coming out of the census and redistricting, and how did you communicate to them that these were important policy issues that they had to care about, get involved in, and have a long-term outlook. The last part is organizing. And I think, like polling, too often it's a flash in the pan. People think they can show up at your church 30 days before the election, or they can show up after they drop a piece of mail or put up a door hanger, and they think that constitutes organizing. And I think what we are seeing now on a community-wide basis, forget partisan politics, just across the board, is if you are not actively engaged and involved, especially with the Black community on an ongoing basis, where you are an ally on the substantive issues of concern to that community's day-to-day life, because the Black community in Houston is different in 3rd Ward and 5th Ward and out in Humble, Texas. And so if you don't understand the divergent differences as well as the commonality, you really can't communicate with them. My dad used to have a saying, you make a friend before you need a friend. And what we're seeing is that in the context of politics, a lot of the people who are candidates for office or involved in parties don't really truly understand that organizing is a long-term relationship building, and in the long-term relationship building, you have got to be willing to hear hard truth. And the hard truths are the 2008 Great Recession exposed to a higher level of consciousness the inequalities economically, socially, health, and the like in the American community. And they were re-exposed and exacerbated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And for a lot of folks, they are now analyzing everything through a much different prism and perspective. And so a lot of those considerations are going to have to really come into the work that's going to be done going forward, analyzing how you make polling more efficient. And the reality is a lot of the methodologies currently being used may have to be revamped altogether or jettisoned to figure out how to have an honest conversation with people. You're almost better off in the Black community to be in the barbershop and the beauty shop. You know, my rule when I was a candidate, I could tell what was important if you went to a couple of barbershop because you'd hear the truth about what people who were not inside the circle were really talking about that was of importance and significance to them and their family. So somewhere we're going to have to go modernize the barbershop, beauty shop, focus group insight that exists out there in the Black community. And you know, social media may give us some perspective, but I look forward to the rest of the conversation. I'll be able to stay on a few minutes and, you know, I'll put some information in the chat at things I think people should take a look at. But this is an outstanding conversation. And my congratulations to you, the Black Women PAC, and thanks to the other speakers for the insight they'll share.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I just wanted to throw out there in your piece that we shared, in the last paragraph, the next 2 years will either be a time for new thinking and new ideas that rise above perceived ideological divides, or it will be a period of self-inflicted divisions and self-inflicted policy failures.
So from a Black perspective, even though Joe Biden was elected, the Democratic Party has really got to understand that the issues and concerns that Black people are worried about, and have some of them already drifting away from the Democratic Party, this is a test for how effective Joe Biden and the Democratic Congress can be. And if they get bogged down in progressive versus moderates, and African Americans, Black folks don't really feel like, and it's not just Blacks, but I'm talking about Black folks today, don't feel like they are seeing progress on getting their issues addressed, not in a generic way, but in a real focused, down-to-earth, substantive way. I think what's really happening out there is we will start to see shifts in where people end up. They may not end up over in the other major party, but it is as impactful if you stay home, or if folks start voting third parties, or if you see a real credible African American make a run for the presidential for president outside of the two main parties. And that's not outside the realm of possibility. And it's not just African Americans, you know, Hispanics, API, the Asian Pacific Islander community, and quote unquote progressives. So the next 2 years are really not just a test for polling and science, but it's also going to be a test for, can you really deliver the kind of changes that people think need to be made to improve the system that is clearly broken and not functioning at the level it needs to function to deliver what was promised, this more perfect union, you know, with access to economic opportunity, not health care, but health outcomes, and not education funding, but education outcomes. So
Wow.
I think people are
Okay.
watching and people
Yeah.
are going to remember.
Right. Okay. So we are going to shift a little bit to Tamika Atkins with Pro Georgia, who is at grassroots, I guess we'll say grassroots, and on the ground in the trenches, knowing what's happening with the people. And I just want to have you talk a little bit about, you know, what Pro Georgia is doing and what you experience and what messaging worked for you guys in Georgia, and how, you know, you got to where Texas is trying to get, you know, just to put it mild, let's put it basic. So please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy, for including me in this conversation. It's been a pleasure listening to the other panelists. As Tracy said, my name is Tamika Atkins. I'm the Executive Director of Pro Georgia, and we are a state table. And I always say that's just a fancy way to say a permanently staffed coalition. And so what I do is I coordinate voter registration and civic engagement efforts amongst local, state-based grassroots organizations. So right now I work with 38 organizations. We started in 2012 with about 13 organizations. We've grown over the last 8 years. I'll also say we are part of a larger network called State Voices. And so there's something about, I think there's now 28 state tables across the country. And so this is how we do our work. We make it easy for community organizations, who we call our trusted messengers, who are already in the community providing direct services, resources, legislative advocacy support for community members. We make it easy for them to embed voter registration and get out the vote GOTV efforts in their ongoing organization, their ongoing organizational programmatic work. And our work, we reduce duplication of efforts so that we can make sure that we are effectively reaching all eligible and unregistered Black and Brown voters in Georgia. So, you know, Georgia has 159 counties, and Texas is the only state that beats us for sheer number of counties. And, you know, all of these counties operate as, you know, individual fiefdoms, frankly. And, you know, so we use data. We use data like the VAN, the Voter Activation Network, to help us target our voter registration efforts so that, again, we can be efficient. What used to happen is, you know, I'll take where my mom lives, for example, Adair Park in the city of Atlanta. What used to happen is that an organization like Georgia WAND, Women Taking Action for New Directions, an environmental justice organization, would knock on her door and get her to sign a petition about the flooding, right, where you can't even drive down her street, so that she can, they can take this petition to a city council member. While they're there, they will register my mother to vote. A week later, Jobs with Justice will come and knock on my mother's door and say, you know, 82% of the population in Adair Park are not making a living wage, right? And we want you to come join our organization. We want to train you on how to advocate for increased wages up to $15 an hour. We want you to come and see if we can form a union where you're at. And while I'm at this door, I also want to register you to vote. So there was a lot of lack of coordination amongst the partners and the organizations. And so what we did was we spread our partners out so that they could work smartly in about 33 counties across the state. Those are the counties with the highest density of eligible and unregistered voters. So something like 60% of the entire Georgia population lives in Metro Atlanta. And of course, that means about 60% of Black and brown folks also live in Metro Atlanta. So I'm gonna try to, because so much good stuff was talked about, but the way we do our work, our theory of change is around access, engagement, and representation, right? So one is that, how do we make sure that people have access to the ballot? So that means how do we reduce barriers and intentional voter disenfranchisement? That means, you know, that we are at the state capitol with community members every year, fighting and pushing back against cuts to early vote that happen every year, cuts to weekend voting and Sunday voting, where we know a lot of our folks come out for souls to the poll and vote after church. We don't even have consistent early voting across all 159 counties. Each county can determine if they're going to have early voting, and if they do, what the time frame is. And that is how, like, voter disenfranchisement is subtle and shows up and impacts us all, right? I live in Henry County, but I work in Fulton County. It's very confusing. And now let's say we've reduced barriers to the ballot. You can vote, right? We've registered you to vote. We've tracked your voter registration application so that, you know, any flags that may have been put on your record, we've contacted you so that we didn't just leave you alone when you registered to vote. We made sure you actually made it onto the rolls. But now, do you want to vote? Do you care about the issues that are affecting your life, right? Do you see them reflected in these conversations that candidates are having, right? So that's where the part where we call engagement. And that's, again, where our partners come in. Our partners who are experts on economic justice, housing rights, disability rights, LGBTQ advocacy, right? And these are, most of our partner organizations are led by Black and brown folks in Georgia, right? So these are local on the ground leaders, and they build relationships with voters. They are already mayors of their block in their neighborhoods and in their communities, right? And so they're working, training, having, now we're doing, right, our Zoom meetings, but having community meetings, going to community centers, going to the schools, the high schools. They are showing up at the senior centers, and they are having conversations about the election and why it matters to you, right? Right now, nationally, there's a lot of conversation about the 2 US Senate seats, right, which is extremely important. And just a reminder, I'm a C3 organization. But what I can tell you is that for people on the ground, what is right up in their face is actually the Public Service Commissioner race, right? Because that is the race. Georgia has some of the highest utility rates in the entire country. And over the last 2 years, we've seen elderly, rural in Southwest Georgia, Black and Latinx folks either have liens on their homes or be threatened with eviction because of their utility rates, because they can't pay their bills when they're $700 to $800 a month. Right? And so the Public Service Commissioner, they have a couple of other roles that they play, but one is in helping to regulate giants like Georgia Power. So for us in state, when we are connecting people on, when we're engaging them, there's the Senate and there's the PSC race, because that is what people are feeling right now. And it's easy and understandable language. Like, this impacts my life today. And so you have access to the ballot, engagement that you want to vote, but now that you can vote, you do vote. Did your vote matter? Was it diluted, right? Through gerrymandering and redistricting, right? Did your community just get packed, right? Up all of us into one community so we have less representation down at the state capitol, or were we split up into more majority white community, more majority right districts, and those districts get drawn very interestingly to reduce the likelihood of us having representation that lifts up our voice down at the state capitol. And, you know, with the census behind us, that is what we are all looking towards in 2021 now, is making sure that districts are, that we have fair districts drawn that do not reduce the power of people of color in the state of Georgia. I can tell you just a little quickly some of our work that we coordinate. So this year alone, we've had over 3 million conversations with registered voters of color in the state of Georgia, over 123,000 phone calls. And those are calls where you actually talk to somebody. We probably made like 600,000 calls. But We sent out 2.8 million text messages and collected over 10,000 pledge to vote cards. And that's where people, typically in their own handwriting, because it's like the psychology says, if you get something in the mail with your handwriting saying you should go vote, people are likely to vote. You know, I could talk about the election protection efforts we have, that Georgia has over 300 polling locations, and amongst our grassroots partners, so these are not people with big budgets, these are local organizations, they were able to effectively monitor 25% of all of the polling locations across Georgia. And because of history and past experience, we already know the counties that are usually the bad actors. We already know the polling locations where lines wrap around. And so we are already ready to go. We know the polling locations where extension cords disappear and machines aren't being turned on. So we know where to go to first so that we can be on the phone with our legal team through the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. And because we're in state, these election officials that we've built relationships with, that's the first step. Let's call you before we call the lawyers. In Georgia, we have something called the exact match law. And that means if your name looks any different from, we call it Department of Driver Services or DMV, from your voter registration form, that you are put on the pending list. And I mean, it could be because you have a hyphen in your name. It could be because there was enough space for your hyphen. It could be because someone misread a letter on the administrative end. And, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that 70% of the pending list is African-American. And then the last thing I'll say is that with this pending list, you can also be put on this list for citizenship status. Pro-Georgia, our partners, we go to nearly every naturalization ceremony in the state of Georgia to register recently naturalized people so that we can plug them right into the electoral process right away. And we discovered people that we registered and we photocopied with their permission their certificate and include it in the voter registration packet. So there's no reason that they should get a flag on their record put on the pending list because of citizenship status. That happened in 2018. And that is part of our lawsuit that we did in 2018 around our exact match lawsuit, right? That this is a this is voter disenfranchisement at its finest, right? We're still in an ongoing lawsuit with the Secretary of State and with the state of Georgia. But, you know, I can go on and on, but I really wanted to, and, you know, speaking with Tracy, is that really what we have been doing, we get asked a lot, what is the secret sauce? Is that what we do is integrated voter engagement. And that means, like Carol said, we don't show up in September. We are there all year, right? And for many years. And so that means that we may have registered you to vote earlier in the year, and then we're going to reach out and call and say, hey, have you voted? Do you need help voting? Do you need a ride to the polls? What, do you need childcare to the polls? That was an experiment we did with the Analyst Institute in 2018, right? How do we close the gap so that you can vote? But then we're also calling you again saying, all right, it's time. The state legislature, they're back in session. You know, here's some of the bills that we think matter to you. Here where your legislators are falling one way or the other. Right? So we are engaging our Black and Brown folks year round on these issues. We don't just go away. And I will also say we fully believe that people need an organizational home. That, you know, we can't just reach out to voters and reach out to voters. We want them to be a part of local organizations so that they can feel their power as a part of a group and as a part of something bigger than them, right? This is how we move from working as individuals and within isolationism to moving as community. There's so much more that I want to say about barbershops and braid shops and nail salons. We're there all day, every day. That's how we build.
You can come back.
Confidence. I could come back.
Yeah, we can do this again.
I want to talk about inconsistent exit interviews. We are inconsistent with getting all these exit interviews, and that's something, and we use data, but I would love to talk with Dr. Camille about how do we have consistent year-round polling, because we actually have the people and the tools, and that is something we can embed in our ongoing work. You know, I'll say just one or two more things. I know.
It's okay. It's okay.
I think how Carol said, he said the path to the goal matters, just the goal. And what we always say, what I always say is how we win matters just as much, if not more, than the win. And so we look at this work not as something that is separate from organizing. And that's, we run into that a lot. This is not work for any of the parties. We are here to protect the vote of Black and brown folks, to support our people in building long-term sustainable power that cannot just be easily taken away from them, right? And that means we have to look at our work at the intersections and not treat voter registration and civic engagement as something separate from community organizing and leadership development.
Wow. Okay, yes, there's more for you to talk about. There's more. So I want to ask, okay, I am impressed and I am really excited about working with other organizations to address the issue at the same time that you're registering to vote, because I think that's the gap. You know, people don't really realize how an elected official affects their life, and you have to draw it to the issue that affects them at that moment. So that is groundbreaking as far as I'm concerned. I haven't heard that before, and not at all. Also, tell me a little bit more about pledging to vote, the handwritten pledge to vote. How does that work? What does that mean? What does that look like?
There are all the data scientists that are much smarter than me. The Analyst Institute is one of the organizations we partner with, and they have all this fun data that they've tested and polling. So, right, everything with the caveat there, that says if we do X, Y is likely to happen. And one of the tools or tricks they've asked us as community organizations to do is get people to pledge to vote. And that means that typically when we were in person, if we are at the train station, if we're at a bus stop and you tell me you're already registered to vote, I ask you, fill this card out with your information, your address, and if we can collect other data, right, like phone, like email, which we then use to update your file so we can continue reaching out to you. Before the election, we mail these pledge to vote cards back to you as a reminder of something you said to yourself. You said, yes, I want to vote this election, and that your voice is stronger than my voice, right? You're more likely to guilt yourself into doing it. And in the past, we've done over 150,000 pledge to vote cards a year. This year, we had to go digital, right? And so we looked at about 10,000 digital pledge to vote cards, but we've still continued the work.
Yeah. I wondered how they got them back. That was the part that I had missed out on. I was like, why did they get them back? But okay. Okay. And so my last question is, and then we're going to close with Dr. Burge, but okay. So my last question, if anybody else has a question, please put it in the chat or put it in the question and answer area. How did you build an organizational home? Tell me how did you say, you know, this is going to be the home, and then how did you build this? Where did the people come from that, you know, support your data and your, you know, how you move? So
I am a coalition, and there are pluses and minuses. You have to have the right kind of person. You have to have a little to no ego. You have to be humble, and you have to see feedback as data and not as personal attacks, right? You cannot be defensive. You have to be able to be solution oriented and willing to pivot in a second. Somehow I've picked up these skills over my life, and we've been pretty successful here in Georgia together. So we started in 2012 under our founding director, Paige Gleason. She started with 12 organizations. And, you know, to understand, Georgia is woefully underfunded. As the South Goes is a report done by Grantmakers for Southern Progress, and they do a whole breakdown about just how very little money comes in to Georgia to community organizations. And, you know, when you say, hey, we want to form this table and we want to work together and make plans together, you're telling organizations, you're asking them not to, in some cases, raise their own funds for voter registration and civic engagement. You're asking them to allow the table to raise those funds for you and trust, right? And which is back to all these is trust that we will equitably distribute the money and that it will pay off in dividends, right? Because now we have these additional tools like the Voter Activation Network that can allow us to work smarter, but they cost $1 bajillion, right? And so we give free access and trainings on how to use these tools to all of our community organizations, any member, volunteer, canvasser, anyone, so that they can use these tools to support their work. One easy example of using the tools is, we had something called the so-called heartbeat bill, HB 481, and we're trying to find folks who would support that issue. And many of our reproductive justice groups, they have their own membership of a couple hundred here, 60 here, but using the voter activation network and modeling, which is this fancy magic that is very invasive, it gathers a lot of data, and they can pull a list using the voter activation network of likely supporters for their issue. That takes organizing to the next level.
Yes.
But we had to reach an agreement, right, that we would not be in competition with them for funding, that we would reduce duplication and turfiness, right? You get used to working where you're working, right? But we had to commit that we would really expand opportunities, and in the long run, this is a benefit to our people and our communities, right? And the proof has been in the pudding. So this is not a year commitment.
Right.
This has been nearly a decade in the making of trust. Really, that's what we've been doing for 10 years with partners, is building trust. And then word of mouth. The table is a great place that gives you all of these tools and resources for your organizing work, funds you to do voter registration and civic engagement, and treats you as a whole person, and does not make this work transactional. In other words, you said 5,000 voter registration forms, you did 3,000. We don't do that. We talk about what was the gap, because maybe there weren't enough events. Let's right size the goal, right? This is not a punitive thing, right? We're building relationships and trust with our partners, and then by extension with the community.
Okay. Wow. So, yeah, a lot to think about, a lot to work on. Okay, so I definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I understand if you have to go, but we are going to close with Dr. Camille Burge, because we did not ask her questions in the beginning, and I know that she has been feverishly taking notes, so she does have some comments to kind of share with us. And so I am just going to turn it over to you. I did have my one little question that seems just insignificant at this point, but please let us know what your thoughts are.
I feel like you should ask it.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, then my question is, since we are having this conversation about, Black America or Black Texas not, being polled in the off season, or in the election cycle, unless there's some emotional outbreak, is it because we automatically vote Democratic, and we just, they count on our vote, so why poll? Why ask us if there is, if we're just guaranteed to, we're just going to go vote?
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction to that is a knee-jerk one, which is that we know that white people have favored the Republican presidential candidate in every presidential election since 1968. And we don't ask questions about polling white Americans, right? We don't ask those questions, even though we know the party that they tend to favor. And so what's being missed in the polling data is the diversity that is available within Black public opinion. And honestly, that diversity could perhaps even help Republicans more so than certain Democrats, right? And thinking about conservative ideology among a number of Black Americans, being conservative on issues pertaining to LGBTQIA, abortion, a number of other policies that we know are out there, that we have political scientists that have done, this work, Teku Lee, Zoltan Hajnal, Angela K. Lewis, who else? Tasha Philpott at UT Austin. So people that have done work on Black conservatism, but there's just so much diversity within the Black community. And to say that, well, because we know they're going to support the Democratic Party, then we shouldn't really care about what they think, right? That to me is the wrong answer, right? And we need to understand, just like we have a really deep understanding of white Americans' public opinion and their political behavior, we need to understand racial and ethnic minorities, because our country is only becoming increasingly diverse. We're not getting less diverse, we're getting more diverse. And so this idea that you would lump individuals into white, non-white when you're analyzing data, or that you would have really small groups, really small samples of people of color, is not going to serve the polling industry well in the future. as we are moving towards greater diversification within this country. And so we have to start thinking about more creative ways to get the true pulse of the people, right? Not just white Americans, but Americans. With all of the diversity that we bring to the table. So not just within the Black community, thinking about diversity within the Latinx community, within the Asian American community, within the indigenous people's communities. There's great diversity within all of those communities that people are, not people, but I would just say like very comfortably that the polling industry has not done a great job, really trying to figure out. We really only care about the issues of these groups, when these inflection points are happening. And I think that's wrong, right? And this is, this is rooted in a lot of history in terms of thinking about, polling these minority communities as well. And so even if, the majority of individuals tend to support a particular party, that shouldn't stop us from wanting to understand the nuances that are involved, right? And again, just to go back to my original point, we don't do that for white Americans, even though for every presidential election since '68, they've supported a Republican candidate. So I think that's it makes me sad.
Well, it's a disrespectful question, so it's okay. So go ahead. Okay, so now what's your notes? You have
Oh man, I was writing a lot when how do you say, was it Carol?
Carol.
When he was speaking, and dealing with the strength of turnout and thinking about how we underestimated support for Donald Trump. When you're looking at the national polls and even some of the state polling, I'm working with APOR right now, the American Association for Public Opinion Research. I'm part of their pre-election task force. So I've been working with and emailing back and forth people like Gallup, Pew, CNN, a number of these other organizations. And we're just now getting into this data to understand like what happened. And one of the conversations that we had a week or so ago, it's like the numbers were pretty spot on for Joe Biden when we're looking at the polling numbers across the United States. The place that was underestimated was support for Donald Trump. And so what could we do as an industry to better figure out, what's going on? One of the theories that was posited in this meeting was about trust. And so this idea that, again, going back to Tamika's comments, trust, but in a different way. So this idea that if you already don't have trust for the media and various outlets, if somebody from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News calls and says, hi, I'm with this organization, would you like to answer these questions? Somebody says no, and they just hang up the phone, right? We don't have these individuals in the sample that we can account for in terms of their opinions. And so when we're then making models about likely voter turnout, and we're using the numbers from the previous election, there's no way to account really for these opinions. Other things that we can't account for, voter suppression, right? Like we can't account for those things, in polling. All we can account for on the front end is who you're likely to support. And if we're pulling numbers, or if we're pulling our sample, from lists of registered voters, that might also be different because we don't know who's registered. It varies by state, as Tamika was saying, in terms of same-day registration versus not. So who are we missing when we're creating these samples? There's all kinds of issues that we're working through now on the back end that all of these organizations work through during the election, before the election, and of course, after the election. And then just the other idea that he brought up about the younger voters, this idea that people have made this claim that as the younger group, the younger generation, Gen Zs, millennials before us, enter the voting space, that somehow they'll be more liberal. And the research that's coming out in political science that I'm more familiar with has said, like, no, that's not the case. There's a really great book that just came out by Candace Watt-Smith and Chris DeSanti on the University of Chicago. It's Racial Stasis, something about the millennial population, and racial stagnation, I think is the subtitle. But what they find in their work is that younger voters, younger people's racial attitudes, younger white people, their racial attitudes look pretty close to their parents, right? Like there's not a whole lot of difference. There's some difference. But the point of the book, the argument they're trying to advance is about a stagnant racial attitude. And so if that's the case, right, if we're thinking even about these instances of racial discrimination and violence that happen in schools, whether it be K through 12 or on college campuses, these insensitive things that are happening, if it's true, if their work is true, then we have a lot of things to think about. Because the idea is that race relations in the workplace will get better as older people leave the workforce and younger people come in their place. The idea is that as older people exit the voting realm, they'll become a more liberal society, and so more people will be voting for Democrat. We don't know that to be exactly true, especially as it pertains to racial attitudes. And so what I think some of this literature is doing, that's coming up to analyze young white voters and their opinions, it's kind of throwing a wrench in, all of these things, like he was saying during his comments. So those were, a couple of things that I was over here writing about, and so incredibly inspired by all of Tamika's work, because I'm from Georgia. I grew up in Alpharetta and have lived there. My family lives in that area since I was 5. And so even being willing to, having seen the change that's happened, you go from Georgia 6th, where you have Newt Gingrich emerge, to now you have Lucy McBath. Who thought that was possible? What'd you say, Tamika? I see you over here in the window pointing your fingers, but who thought that was possible in, that area of Georgia? Not many people, but we have to think about what some folks have been talking about online and in these different circles, right? The South and the power of Black voters, right? And this has been something that we've known about since Reconstruction. When we get the first enfranchisement to vote, and what happens? Black people get put in office in tremendous numbers across the South. And people recognize that power. So what do we want to do? Take that power away. What do we want to do when recently freed African Americans, those who were enslaved, are freed, and poor white farmers come together to build coalitions and start running candidates and bills? We don't want that. But there are some people that have a vested interest in that not happening, right? And so when we think about mobilization and moving people forward, and especially in the South, right, there's a great chance for politicians, local, state level, especially, to appeal to Black voters, but they need to understand their issues. They need to understand the things that they care about, so that they can understand what they need to do in terms of building their platform.
Yeah, don't define it for us. I hear you. Ask us. And then when they ask us, please answer. Answer truthfully, brutally truthfully, okay? Just answer, okay? All the cuss words or not, but answer, okay? So I thank you, everyone. We are 13 minutes over, and that's, I think, great. That means that the conversation was interesting. We definitely had a lot to share. I am so very thankful. This is all possible, again, through the Texas Coalition of Black Democrats, the Next Wave Strategies and Woven Strategies, and all of the partners that help the Black Women's PAC make this possible. Also, Kendall is here, who just recently joined our team and with the Tarrant County Black Democrats, and he's helping. So I thank you very much, ladies. I hope that we can visit again, and just kind of continue this dialogue, continue the relationship, and just help us move forward and whatever we can do here in Texas. So, okay, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everyone else, the audience. Hey, y'all, thanks. Okay, take care. Oh, happy holidays. There you go. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, so could all of the panelists still stay on? I don't know if you guys saw my message in the chat. I just want to get a quick screenshot. So 1 second.